From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Earlier this morning, Liz Schuler was elected the first female president of the AFL-CIO, succeeding Richard Trumka. Later in this hour, we will have the first interview with the new AFL-CIO president right here on Balance of Power. But in the meantime, we're going to start, of course, with Afghanistan, as the United States and its allies continue to evacuate personnel amid reports of protests on the ground. We turn to our Washington correspondent, Anne-Marie Hordern, at the White House. So, Anne, what is the latest that we hear from the U.S. government?
Well, we're going to be awaiting the president. He's going to be making remarks, David, at the top of the next hour, and I'm going to be in the East Room waiting to hear what the president has to say to the American people. Now, remember his first speech on Afghanistan earlier this week, he did not take questions. He gave a speech on COVID and he did not take questions. Then, of course, he gave that interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC, and many are saying he seemed very frustrated and almost annoyed in this interview. So we want to see what he has to say to the American people about what is going on in Afghanistan and Kabul. Right now, it's all about making sure they can secure the airport. And the Pentagon yesterday said they have 5,200 troops there. So potentially we're still waiting to get to that 6,000. But even if the airport is secured, David, the question really is about the safety getting to the airport, because the Taliban has certainly really ramped up those checkpoints in Kabul.
Yeah, speaking about the tone with that interview with George Stephanopoulos, we had Ed Rendell, a friend of President Biden's, on the program on Balance of Power yesterday, who said he doesn't think the president's got that tone right yet. So, Anne-Marie, we obviously are mostly concerned about the people in Afghanistan, whether they're U.S. citizens or others, who are going through an awfully hard time right now. But it also has possible ramifications up on Capitol Hill. We've got the House coming back in next week, ostensibly to deal with infrastructure and deal with Build Back Better, as the president calls it. Is this going to interfere with his ability to get things done up on Capitol Hill as long as Afghanistan's issue is pending?
Well, it already is. Today, we already have the Gang of Eight on the Democrat side for the House having a briefing with the administration about what is going on in Afghanistan. And then we're going to have a hearing as well on Monday. So while, yes, Speaker Pelosi is pushing through the economic agenda for the president, it would be dishonorable to say that Afghanistan is not the fixation of Washington, and that is certainly going to overhang the president's agenda next week. Okay,
Anne-Marie, thank you so much for that reporting from the White House. That's Anne-Marie Hordern, our Washington correspondent. The House of Representatives, as we just said, is coming back into session on Monday to address bills on infrastructure and the budget, but with those events in Afghanistan very much casting a long shadow. We welcome now a veteran of Washington policy and politics. Russ Vought served as director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Trump. He went on to found the Center for Renewing America. So, Mr. Vought, thank you so much for being back with us. I want to talk about the budget. I want to talk about infrastructure. But first, we have to spend just a moment on Afghanistan. From your experience in Washington, how much will this interfere with the president's ability to get through Congress, what was already going to be a difficult task?
I think it'll interfere with the administration's ability to help get it through Congress, and particularly when they're dealing with a handful of moderates in the Democrat Party that do not want to support both of these bills at the same time. And I think that will be a challenge, but I also think it will be beneficial to some extent for Speaker Pelosi, because she'll have the ability to have most of the debate and the attention of the nation focused on the critical situation in Afghanistan. And so to the extent that folks are not focused on the floor of the House of Representatives, that helps her potentially roll some moderates to be able to keep these two bills linked.
Well, let's talk about those moderates, because before the crisis in Afghanistan developed, we did have some moderates writing to the speaker saying, we want to take up the bipartisan infrastructure bill wholly without regard to the budget resolution. We're not going to wait on the $3.5 trillion part. Give me your position on that bipartisan infrastructure bill. If you could just get that done, does that make good sense?
I don't believe it does. It is largely unpaid for. It is minimally for infrastructure, and they are completely tied together. And so, if this was a paid-for infrastructure bill of hardcore infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, and we were able to really pay for, not something where you just are using accounting fictions and you're pushing costs into the future, that would be a conversation to have that has never been the kind of conversation that the Democrats wanted to have. They wanted to be able to focus on things like electrical vehicles and things that are just not part of real infrastructure. So, no, I would be opposed to this. I think Republicans need to be opposed to this with everything they've got, and furthermore, because the two bills are linked together.
Of course, Republicans are not opposed to this with everything they've got. We've had Republican senators on this program saying, you know what, in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the smaller one, we got it down to the core infrastructure. We are dealing with roads and bridges, to be sure, some broadband, which a lot of Republicans believe is part of infrastructure. Are they just wrong?
I believe they are. I believe that they have a desire to pass a bipartisan package and to work with the Biden administration. And I think that they have, unfortunately, ignored what Speaker Pelosi and Schumer have said, which is that these two bills are linked and that they are going to the president together until that changes, and it has not changed. We do not know if the Democrat moderates are able to show up and force the hand of their speaker. Very hard to do. And so Senate Republicans have enabled this entire process by going along with the bipartisan package in the Senate and by giving it the imprimatur of being bipartisan.
So, Mr. Vogt, I fully understand that Nancy Pelosi has said they are linked, but we do have moderates insisting they're not. I guess my question to you is, if in fact she ends up backing down, the moderates have their way, and they can just take up the infrastructure bill that was passed by the Senate, would you be okay with that? Because after all, President Trump certainly wanted infrastructure. He wanted something much bigger than that. He was in favor of it.
Well, he was in favor of real infrastructure, and he was in favor of making sure it was part of an entire fiscal program that could be paid for. Every time we tried to do a deal with Democrats, they insisted that we raise taxes. And so to the extent that this is part of a bill to raise taxes or attached to a bill that would raise taxes, it would be a non-starter for our administration. And so from the standpoint of a standalone bill, I don't think it's actually infrastructure. I don't think we can afford it. I think it further increases our debt and deficits at a time where we're dealing with potentially increased inflation going forward. And the wheels are coming off fiscally. And at some point, you have to take a step back and say, what can we afford and how can we afford it? And that doesn't mean you don't move forward and fix roads and bridges, but it has to be done in a conversation of a real offset debate and a framework, and not just accounting fictions that make it look good.
So, Russ, I think I understand that position, but do you understand some Democrats who come back and say, wait a second, this is the pot calling the kettle black? After all, those tax cuts back in 2017 didn't get paid for. I know there was dynamic scoring that said that they would, but I haven't seen any scoring after the fact that suggests, in fact, it did not add to the deficit.
Well, we had an enormous shock to the system with COVID. Before that, our economic program was well on schedule to be able to pay for the cost of the tax cuts, in conjunction with the rest of our economic agenda. Increased energy exploration, trade reform, all of these things were contributing to us being able to pay for it. And we were seeing it in not just our own numbers, but in the numbers of the CBO. They kept doing updates to their economic numbers, and over time we had already paid for much of the static cost of the tax cut. So look, we were well on our way. Things happened. Unfortunately, we dealt with the economic shock and the pandemic of COVID, and that does change things. And so now we're in a situation where we got to try to urge the Biden administration to stick to pro-growth policies. They're not going to. And we're dealing with what we can afford as a country, and that right now is not the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that the bipartisan group has put forward.
So, Mr. Vogt, finally, I do think of you as a policy person. I'm going to ask you a politics question. Forgive me for doing that. We do have midterm elections coming up. As you look forward to those, to what extent do you think they will be determined, the outcomes will be determined by the so-called pocketbook issues? And after all, you talk about pro-growth, the economy is growing pretty robustly, certainly through this year, and many people think into next year.
Sure. Just that last point first. It is certainly, anytime you're coming out of an economic shock of what we're seeing, of course you're going to grow. The extent to which we grow faster and as much as we possibly could is the question, and the extent to which the administration's policies hang on that growth is still to be determined. But I do think it's going to be a pocketbook election, but not just pocketbooks. The Biden administration is not sticking to pocketbook issues. They have a very left-wing agenda that is going at the American people on every level, culturally, economically, in their pocketbooks, in their schools, in their universities, and in their employment situations. And all of those things are going to be on the table from the next election, including his handling of the nation's foreign affairs and whether people are secure. And so to that extent, all of those issues are going to be something that the American people are going to give their say as to how this administration is doing, and I don't think it's going to go very well.
Okay, Russ, really appreciate you spending time with us. It was very helpful. It's Russ Vought. He's former OMB director and Center for Renewing America president. Coming up, we're going to talk with Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy about efforts to get the Alaska cruise industry back up and running. And then later in the program, we will have an exclusive conversation with the newly elected AFL-CIO president, Liz Schuler. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The FBI says it has found little evidence that the January 6th break-in at the Capitol building was centrally coordinated in an effort to overturn the presidential election results. Reuters, citing current and former law enforcement officials, reports that cells of protesters had aimed to break into the Capitol, but there was no proof that they had serious plans about what to do if they made it inside. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has extended a nationwide lockdown by 4 days following an outbreak of the Delta strain of the coronavirus.
We just don't quite know the full scale of this Delta outbreak. All in all, that tells us we need to continue to be cautious and that we need more time before we have the complete picture we need to change our settings.
While New Zealand has been among the best in the world at keeping out COVID-19, its vaccination rollout has been one of the slowest. Less than 20% of the population of New Zealand has been fully immunized. And in Australia, Sydney's 2-month-long lockdown will be extended until at least the end of September. A curfew will be placed on areas of Western Sydney hardest hit by the outbreak. The Delta variant outbreak has gotten worse in the country's biggest city. AstraZeneca's COVID-19 antibody cocktail was found to be 77% effective in preventing symptomatic COVID-19 in high-risk people. That could expand the range of drugs available to vulnerable groups. The company says the study found that no one in the trial who received the cocktail contracted severe COVID-19 or died in relation to the disease. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Like the rest of the country, Alaska was hit hard by the pandemic, not least by the economic hit taken by its cruise industry. Welcome now, Alaskan Governor Mike Dunleavy. So, Governor, thank you so much for being with us. I start with the cruise industry because before, when you were on with me, you were pointing out it's really important that we save this summer season for Alaska Cruise Lines. Where are we?
So we just started getting our cruise ships back just a couple weeks ago, David, and we got them back. It was late in the season. We don't have the numbers that we usually have in terms of the cruise ships. So we've got a portion of our season back. We have a portion of our cruise ships back. We're very glad they're here. And it's going to, I think they're going to extend the season past September into early October. And we're hoping that more people come up, but nonetheless, it's a smaller cruise ship season with less ships, and it's a shortened season.
Do you have any sense, Governor, of how much smaller it is? I mean, just saying on a basis of 0 to 100% compared to where you were before, are you at 25%, do you think? You think you'll be at 50%? Where are you?
I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% of what we had, because we basically we had a robust cruise season here for years, and this is just this is probably a fraction of a quarter of it, but nonetheless, it's welcome. We're going to see what happens next year. The other issue, as you know, is that it was difficult for travelers to get to Alaska overland as well because Canada was pretty tightly closed down. But one of the silver linings is there was a lot of individual travelers that have flown into Alaska, so that's helped tremendously.
So, Governor, you did have some instances early on, I read about, where you had some COVID cases. You had protocols in place. Give us your sense of how they dealt with this situation, because it sounded like they were fairly mild symptoms, and they sort of took care of it.
Yeah, well, you're going to have, that's correct, and we did. And you're going to have COVID with us for some time. If you look at some of the research journals now, David, most of the scientists believe that COVID's going to be around here for years, if not forever. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. But nonetheless, there have been cases. Our cases are rising like everyone else, but most of our elders, our seniors, and vulnerable population have been vaccinated. Alaska is somewhere around 55, 60% vaccinated overall population. And so the cases are rising. We're working to try and stem that rise, but nonetheless, we're going to have to learn to live with this virus. We're not contemplating any shutdowns. We're not contemplating any lockdowns at all. And like the rest of the world, we're going to have to just bowl through it.
Governor, another important part of your economy is energy. I know you're very close to the energy situation. You have an administration in Washington. It's pretty different from the Trump administration in dealing with it. Give us your sense about the energy policy coming out of Washington right now in the Biden administration.
It's night and day. The Trump administration was all about opportunity. And any chance of opportunity, any type of opportunity, the Trump administration was working with our state to try and bring that to reality. The opposite's happening. This is now an administration of cancellation. Yesterday, or day before, we just had a federal court judge rule that our Willow project, which is an oil project, about 140,000 barrels estimated per day, that cannot go forward at this point. We've had our ANWR leases challenged by the Biden administration, offshore oil challenged by the Biden administration. Even our mining, we have some of the best mining prospects in the world. The Biden administration is looking at other countries to provide their rare earths and their critical minerals. And so right now, Alaska is taking a beating from the federal government. We're going to fight back. We've put millions of dollars into a state defense approach to make sure that we have our day in court if we need to push back on this administration. But nonetheless, all of these opportunities that were coming about under the last administration, this administration is trying to do everything they can to make sure it doesn't happen. We don't understand why. It doesn't help America, doesn't help Alaska, puts opportunity overseas, wealth, jobs, you name it. Doesn't make any sense, David.
Governor, I wonder if you disagree with everything they're doing, because on the one hand, fossil fuels, no question you have a disagreement about the approach to that. But what about renewables? I mean, I know you had Energy Secretary Granholm up there in Alaska. You actually met with her, I believe, and
Yes.
They want to invest in renewables. We think of Alaska as just about oil. It's not. You're also very involved in renewables.
No, that's true. And we will work with the Biden administration on that. And we've been in contact, as you mentioned, with the secretary. I spoke with her last week for a few days or a few hours. We have tremendous renewable opportunities here in the state of Alaska: geothermal, wind, onshore, offshore wind, tidal, hydro, you name it, we have it, and we want to capitalize on that. And so we are working with those interests that want to promote renewable energy. We just believe that you can have both: a robust renewable approach and a robust oil and gas approach. And I think if we are able to put that in place for Alaska, it's going to bode well for everybody.
So finally, quickly here at the end, Governor, what about inflation? We're talking about that certainly in the lower 49, if I can call it that way. What's the situation in Alaska? Because I've seen some indications you've got some inflation struggles going on up there.
Like everyone else, we do. And because of our distance from markets and our small market, a lot of things have always cost more here in Alaska. Prices are going up, no doubt about it, on goods and services, food stuff, you name it, gasoline, fuel, diesel. Just like everywhere else. And again, as I mentioned, David, our distance from market always adds that extra cost. So we're keeping an eye on that. And again, one of the ways to deal with inflation, especially when it comes to fuel, is produce more oil and gas here in America, here in Alaska, to keep the price lower.
Okay, Governor, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Appreciate your time. That's Governor Mike Dunleavy of Alaska. Coming up, we are going to have an exclusive conversation with the newly elected AFL-CIO president. She is Liz Schuler. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's the last trading day of what has been, I think, a turbulent week in the markets. To give us a recap, we welcome now Bloomberg markets reporter Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, welcome. Great to have you. It's been turbulent news between Afghanistan and COVID and China and things like that. The markets look like they've been churning around a bit, too.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And on top of that, we got a sort of indication that we're tapering now. So, I mean, it really is that wall of worry. What's interesting to me, though, is, of course, we know that there's a risk-off week ahead, or in this past week, it has been a risk-off week. And this, of course, coming off the record highs from Friday. But what did really well this week? It was the dollar, that reversion back to those safe haven trades. It's kind of this old habits die hard kind of phenomenon. But you also saw the volatility increase as well, naturally coming off of the risk-off week. And bonus, you also saw healthcare stocks up as well, 1.9%. But it's no surprise there, right? When you start having those Delta variant fears, you hop into those vaccine makers fairly quickly.
Well, I just focus on the dollar for a moment, because it strikes me that's because there's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. We rush to the dollar. At the same time, if anything, the Fed, it looks like they may be tapering faster than we thought.
Absolutely. And, you know, this isn't exactly the taper tantrum that everyone was expecting, right? We were expecting that the minute they confirmed it, for sure, it gave us some sort of timeline, there'd be a stronger reaction. But instead, it's those Delta variant concerns that are coming up far, far hotter. And today's options action actually shows this a lot, because you do have, it's supposed to be options expiry day. It's supposed to be quadruple witching. And yet you have a fairly quiet market. You have volume actually low. And I mean, just looking on the screen for our TV audience and for our radio audience, I'll let you know that, of course, on a 1 week basis, you have crude really, really tumbling. So that dollar spillover effect really showing up in commodities in addition to the Delta variant growth. And something to keep in mind, I'm just going to conclude this here really quickly, is today, Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan actually talked about the fact that he might reconsider his stance on tapering, which is huge because he was one of the first ones to actually consider it.
Yeah, and is that because, again, of COVID, the concern that COVID may slow down the recovery? I mean, that may affect oil, for example. The oil demand globally might go down, but also it might reconsider that. Although some people say, you know what, if in fact COVID slows things down, it's not clear it will deter inflation.
Yeah, and those supply chain shortages don't make it any easier. So you kind of have this perfect storm. I like to call days or weeks like this the risk-off jambalaya, because it really is a mix of a ton of different factors. And I think the best way to see it, the best way to get kind of real-time evidence, is to look at that commodity sell-off that you're seeing really spurring off of Asia and potentially here not too soon.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The other factor we have to take into account is the beach. It is late August.
Yes,
you know,
it is.
That does affect volumes, and maybe, I'm not sure who's at their trading desks right now.
Just a touch. You know, our executive editor, Chris Nagy, actually pointed out that we have a seasonality factor here as well. The third week of March is always seasonally risk off. So there is that
third
to
week
add
of
into.
August?
Third week of August.
You said March. Okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Third week of August.
I don't remember how third week of March.
I'm sorry. Third week of August is seasonally risk off. So on top of this wall of worry and this risk off jambalaya, you also have seasonality to add as well.
That's fascinating. Great report for the weekend. We'll see how it ends up today. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. She's our markets reporter here at Bloomberg. Coming up, we're going to have an exclusive conversation with the newly elected AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler. And yes, she is a woman. That is the first time a woman has ever led the AFL-CIO. They represent, after all, over 12.5 million workers across the country. We're going to get to the chance to talk to Ms. Schuler first. And this is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. All of us were shocked by the sudden loss of Richard Trumka, the longtime head of the AFL-CIO, just over 2 weeks ago now. Today, the organization that represents over 12.5 million workers nationwide elected Rich's successor, Liz Schuler, who had served as his secretary-treasurer since 2009. We are privileged to have her join us now on Balance of Power, her first appearance since assuming her new role. So first of all, congratulations, Ms. Schuler. It's great for you to ascend, for the first woman, I must say, to head the AFL-CIO. If you'll forgive me, let's spend just a minute on Rich, because, I mean, he was very close to you, near and dear to you, to all the members of the AFL-CIO, and even to Balance of Power. We had him on every week. We miss him badly. Just reflect on what the legacy is that Rich Trumka leaves behind.
Well, thank you, David. And you're right. Rich enjoyed this show every Friday, and I watched you too. And so it feels a bit strange to be sitting in this seat, but I'm still mourning the loss of my friend and my partner of 12 years. He was a giant in the labor movement. He was a fighter. he was able to get so much done for working people that some of them don't even know about, like the protections in the trade agreement, the USMCA, that we're now seeing the results of for workers in Mexico, the US, and Canada. So I'm working through the loss. The labor movement is still mourning, but at the same time, I'm ready. I'm stepping into leadership at this very sad and heartbreaking moment, but we're ready to move forward in the labor movement.
And Rich, I think, would be the first to say he got a lot done, but there's a lot left to do, a lot that he was working on. Give us a sense of what's at the top of your agenda as you take over this position.
Absolutely, and the best way we can honor Rich is by continuing to fight for the things he spent his life fighting for. And that is to give working people a voice and to make sure that everyone in this country has a good, sustainable job. And right now on Capitol Hill, we're debating investment. We know with the Budget Reconciliation Act, we're looking at investments in families, in working people, in infrastructure. And we are absolutely committed to making sure that those are good union jobs. So I think we have a lot of work on our plate. Certainly with infrastructure, the Voting Rights Act that we know needs to be passed because our democracy is under attack. And we want to keep fighting for the PRO Act, which is the labor law reform that we believe now will be named after Richard L. Trumka, the Richard L. Trumka PRO Act.
So let's start on PRO Act, because I don't think we ever had Rich Trumka on that he didn't talk about the PRO Act. We had to get to it sooner or later. At the same time, it's having a tough time in the Senate. You got it through the House, not in the Senate side. What are the prospects of getting it through? And for that matter, how is your working relationship going to be with President Biden? Because Rich Trumka was quite close with President Biden.
Absolutely, and we are laser focused on continuing that fight on Capitol Hill, but more importantly, in the streets and on the ground. We have a grassroots movement in every state, in every major city in this country, and working people have had enough. They know the labor laws are broken in this country, and when you try to organize a union, you're fired, you're discriminated against, and harassed, and that needs to change. So we need the PRO Act to make sure that people who want to come together and have a voice on the job and fight for better wages and better benefits and a decent living to support their families can do it without fear. So we're going to continue to push forward, on Capitol Hill, of course, but as I said, through this grassroots movement that we've built that is unlike any other in the country.
So give us a sense, those of us who are not in Washington, how it works, because it was going to be something of a tough battle, I think, to get the PRO Act, not to speak of voting rights, through before we had the collapse in Afghanistan. Do you think that affects what's going up on Capitol Hill, or can you get the attention back on the workers fast enough to get something done?
Well, we all know the challenges with getting things done in Congress these days. The filibuster has prevented us from moving forward on so many pieces of legislation. And our very democracy is at risk. And we know that S1 is ready to be acted on. But we need to change the rules of the filibuster to make sure that we can actually give people a voice at the ballot box and in the decision making in this country. We should make it easier to vote, not more difficult. And workplace democracy goes hand in hand with democracy in this country. And right behind it, voting rights comes worker rights and the PRO Act. So we believe that we have a shot at changing the rules in the Senate, bringing this vote to the floor, and continuing to look for creative and innovative ways to get protections in other legislative vehicles so that we can deliver for working people who want to have a union in their workplace.
So Liz, let's go to another thing that you mentioned, was some of the other legislation right now that's pending up on Capitol Hill and getting union jobs, for example, on infrastructure. We hear that from President Biden himself when he announced the electric vehicle initiative. He specifically said union jobs. How does that work? Is it put in the legislation they have to be union jobs, or how does that work if the legislation does get enacted?
We want to make sure that all these investments are tax dollars that are going into creating a better energy infrastructure, cleaner energy infrastructure, our transportation systems, our care infrastructure, because we know care is essential infrastructure to allow us to go to work. That all of those jobs are creating good standards for people. So yes, we want to attach labor standards to these investments so that our tax dollars are actually working for us, the people who pay the bills. So that's our plan. We want to make sure that when we're planning for green energy future, that we're going to actually be creating jobs that are sustainable, that will allow people to support their families, because we know that a good job is at the center of all of this. We are so proud when we get a good job, right? This unlocks opportunity for people. And we in the labor movement know that a good job isn't a good job without a union. The union is what brings standards up and allows us to come together with all of our voices to become more powerful and make sure that all those jobs are good union jobs.
You refer to the labor movement. Let's talk about that a bit, because to some extent you're fighting against a tide. As you know, particularly on the private sector, the percentage of workers who are represented by organized labor has been going down. I think it's something like 10.8% now in the country. It's down well the last 20, 30 years. How can you resist that? Is the PRO Act enough to get you there?
Well, of course, we need to use our legislative levers, which we're doing. The PRO Act would fix what's broken with labor law, and that's what's so hard for people to come together and form a union, is because the law is not working for working people. It's working for big corporations. And we need to use those levers, but we also know that grassroots organizing is happening on the ground. The pressure is building on the ground, especially through this pandemic, where we had frontline essential workers going to work without the proper safety protections. Workers who want to speak out are afraid because they know they'll get fired and the law is not on their side. So yes, we need to build the pressure on the ground along with the pressure on Capitol Hill, and we think we can do both, walking and chewing gum at the same time.
And talking about the future, I've heard you speak some on this. Talk about how you get younger workers really engaged in the labor movement, and particularly when the entire nature of work is changing to a gig economy, to on-demand, things like that. Something you've been working on. What can you do to get the younger people to say, yeah, I think a union's a good idea?
The labor movement is open. Our doors are open wider than ever. We are looking for young people to join us because they have so much energy and enthusiasm, and they're taking risks every day. We're seeing it in the streets. Look at movements like Black Lives Matter and the strikes that are happening right now as we speak with nurses in Massachusetts and mine workers in Alabama and bakery workers in cities all across the country. They have had enough. And they're making their voices heard, and they're standing up, and they're now on strike because they know if they don't stand up for what's right and draw a line, the wages and benefits continue to slide. And we need to actually come together as a collective voice in order to have more power. And that's what a union's all about. And I think people in this country, especially young people, are waking up to this notion that we really don't have power unless we stand together. And throughout this pandemic, we've seen how work has been changing. And as you spoke of, technology is starting to affect every industry, every sector of our economy. And are we going to sit back idly by and be governed by apps and artificial intelligence without some guardrails, right? So we have to fight back to make sure that jobs continue to be good jobs in the future, and not just sit passively and allow the world to change around us without having a voice at that table and without being able to co-create what that future looks like.
Liz, finally, and this is a tricky question for me. I don't think for you, but for me, it's a tricky question. You were the president of the AFL-CIO, and congratulations once again on that election today. You're not the female president, you're the president. At the same time, you are a woman, the first woman to hold that position. Does that give you certain opportunities, do you think?
Well, absolutely. Rich used to say all the time that he appreciated having a woman partner right alongside him because we do bring different strengths, different styles of leadership. And, you know, being in the labor movement, we are half the labor movement. Not many people realize the labor movement is the largest organization of working women in the country, 6.5 million women. So I intend to stand on the shoulders of those giants, the women who have come before me, the women who led those strikes and were on the picket lines, and also the quiet strength of women in the workplace who have been leaders in every workplace around our great country. And I'm so honored to lead forward and provide an example for all those women out there who haven't yet seen the labor movement as a pathway for them. And it truly is.
Okay, Ms. Schuler, one more time, congratulations. That is Liz Schuler. She's the brand new president of the AFL-CIO.
Thank you, David.
Coming up as we approach a recall vote in California, we talk with the last California governor to go through the process, Gray Davis. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. California voters go to the polls next month to decide whether Governor Gavin Newsom should keep his job. And if not, who should replace him? Gray Davis knows the feeling. He was just into his second term as California governor when he faced a recall, one that resulted in Arnold Schwarzenegger taking over control of the state. Welcome now, Mr. Davis, to Bloomberg. So, Governor, thank you so much for being with us. I am curious about what you think is going on in California.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you. Before I begin, I just want to add my comments to Liz. Richard Trumka was a larger-than-life figure, and he energized the labor movement. We're all going to miss him. He was a giant of a man, and because I worked with him personally in his capacity when he was running the mine workers organization. He just made such a difference. He gave people so much hope that life would get better. And we need more people like him. Yeah,
that was certainly my experience, our experience here at Balance of Power with him. Really big shoes to fill. But as far as California goes, you have a recall again going on. As I say, you've gone through this. What precipitates this? What's the problem that Gavin Newsom has out there?
Well, two things. First of all, the recall, the repeal, and the initiative were reforms passed in 1911, 110 years ago. Everyone running for office in California is well aware that the people in California have the first and last word. And if you don't like that, well, don't run for office in California, run someplace else. So you can't moan and groan. It's just part of life in California. I never complained. I dealt with it. I got 45% of the vote. And there was a video that came out from Enron, who was basically a criminal enterprise, pure and simple, ordering a blackout in San Francisco 4 days after we'd all been summoned back to Washington to try and work something out. And if that video had been available during my election, I think the results might have been different. So segueing to 2021, Governor Newsom is going to win this election. He's got a lot of things going for him. He's got almost 4 million more Democrats than I had. The registration was about even in 2003. Now there's 3.8 million more Democrats. And he's got President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and many other surrogates coming out to make the case for him. It'll be a tough race, but he should win by 5, 6, 7 points in my judgment.
How much of it is within his power? I mean, again, we can go back to your experience as well. Looking at it from the outside, some factors are outside your power. For example, I think back with you, one of the problems was the collapse of the dot-com bubble that really hurt the California economy. Right now, we have issues such as crime, for example, cost of living issues, homelessness in California.
Yes, but life gives you good news and bad news. The good news for Governor Newsom is that the surplus he is enjoying is $80 billion, more than anyone predicted on a $240 billion surplus. So what does that mean? That means the economy is actually working well for a lot of people out here, and there's money to be spent to help renters pay back rent, all the back rent, including utilities. There's $10 billion on its way to revive small business. There's schools opened on Monday. So things are getting back to normal out here. Are there problems? Yeah, homelessness is a big problem. And he's allocated $12 billion for that. I can get into more detail if you like. But every person at every issue has to understand this. We are all God's children. Every homeless person has to be treated with dignity. But if there's a place they can be housed, and there are many motels the state now owns, and there are mental health services available once every 2 weeks, then that person should go there, and that place he occupied should be reclaimed. That's starting to happen in Venice and other places, but it has to happen on a faster pace to please people and let them know local government and state government are working together to solve this problem. But it is soluble, and I'm glad to see all people finally moving in the right direction.
So how important is the opposition, who the alternatives are that are on the ballot when you have a recall? I mean, you had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has a fair amount of name recognition, I think it's fair to say. I'm not sure that Gavin Newsom has the same situation.
Well, that's a little bit of understatement there, David. Arnold is bigger than life. He had a $1 billion campaign for Terminator 2, which opened in July. He announced in August, and the election was September 6th. Plus, he was married to the Kennedy family. And as you're putting up the faces of people up there, there's no one even in his galaxy. I always say, people, if you have a chance to choose your opponent, don't choose an action hero who the Kennedy family. Anyone else will be much better. And Gavin has anybody else.
Does the opposition also affect the initial vote? As I understand it, the vote is in two pieces. One is, do I want the current governor to stay? And if we decide no, then we talk about who it is. Does it affect whether I vote to keep the current person in?
Yes, I think it does. And I'll give you an example. So the lieutenant governor ran last time, and that was the problem for me. I got 45% of the vote. I was only polling in the high 20s, but we ran a good campaign. Dianne Feinstein did a terrific job, a lot of other surrogates. So I'm 5 points below what I need. And his message to his voters was vote no on the recall, but yes on Bustamante. However, a third of his voters got 31% of the vote, 10% of the vote voted yes on the recall. So if they're very attractive people in the question number 2, that will influence people's judgment on question number 1. And I strongly urge the Democratic Party not to put an insurance candidate, if you will, in other words, a second choice on the ballot, but to stay focused on what really matters, was keeping Governor Newsom in power, who's done a good job on the pandemic. He's making community college essentially free, doing good things on healthcare, and deserves the right to finish his term.
Governor, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. That is Gray Davis. He is, of course, the former governor of California. Coming up, President Biden will be appearing at the White House shortly to address, once again, the crisis in Afghanistan. We'll preview what to expect with our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden already had a full agenda in front of him before his withdrawal of U.S. forces precipitated a crisis in Afghanistan. Earlier, I spoke with Larry Summers of Harvard for Wall Street Week coming up tonight, and I asked him whether this latest crisis threatens the president's economic plans, and he said it really depends on how it plays out.
But if we are substantially successful with respect to the evacuations, and this doesn't dent the president's overall standing, I don't think the effect is going to be very large. If the president loses 10 approval points, all bets are off.
Joining us now is Joe Matthew. He's Bloomberg Washington correspondent and, of course, the host of Sound On Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, you heard Larry there. It's sort of a fork in the road. It goes one of two ways. What does it look like in Washington?
I think he framed it perfectly, David. We've arrived at a really important inflection point here, and what the president is about to say is going to have a lot to do with what happens in the next couple of weeks on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. It's not just about what he says in the speech, though, David. A lot of people are wondering if he's actually going to take questions and have an exchange with reporters. The East Room in the White House behind me is filling up as we speak. And, of course, as we know, the president has not been answering questions outside of a one-on-one interview this week that didn't seem to win him a lot of friends. When you look at the recent history, though, here, David, it's pretty tough. White House tells us they got about 9,000 people out of Afghanistan in the past week, since August 14th. But if you look at the conversation going back a couple of months, particularly on Capitol Hill, people were warning, in some cases begging this White House to act earlier in getting our allies, specifically our Afghan allies, out of that country in time.
The other question is, besides what he says, even in response to questions, how much of it is tone? Because we had Ed Rendell on yesterday on Balance of Power, a former governor of Pennsylvania, a good friend of President Biden, who says he's getting the tone wrong.
I was struck by that interview with Ed Rendell, and I think that he really described what a lot of Americans thought. It was likely the end of a pretty long day for Joe Biden. It's been a pretty long week and a long month. And he seemed defensive. That was the real word I think that I would use, more than angry or even frustrated, David. I have a feeling he'll be walking in front of this press corps with a very different posture today.
Yeah, well, we'll be watching along with you. Thank you so much. Always great to have you. That's Joe Matthew, of course, our Washington correspondent, also the host of Sound On. You can hear it every afternoon, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. And you know what? In our second hour, we're going to cover that President Biden's remarks on Afghanistan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.